I'm reviewing the third episode in the series from Christianity Today called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, the church planted and led by Mark Driscoll. The title of this episode, number 3, is You Read Your Bible, Ringo? Now, my purpose in these reviews is not to restate what Christianity Today said about Mars Hill or Mark Driscoll. But what I want to do is I want to learn from these things in order to be a better Christian. So the particular bend that I have in these videos as I review that series is how can we personally apply these things to our lives so that we can learn and not make those mistakes for the fame of God and the benefit of each other. Hello everyone, Rick Thomas here. Again, I'm reviewing Christianity Today's series, The Rise and Fall of Mark Driscoll. This is episode 3. The title of it is, You Read Your Bible, Ringo? Now that quote comes from the movie Pulp Fiction. I do not recommend that movie. I do not recommend that you watch it. It is a gratuitously violent movie that is extremely vulgar. But I did look up the quote, and that's where I landed. I watched a brief 3-minute video clip, and again, that's just where the title came from. So I hope your curiosity is assuaged and you don't need to go into the Pulp Fiction world. Now, in this particular episode 3, I want to make 6 personal applications from the things that Mark Driscoll, that Mike Hosper presented in his podcast. But first, I want to revisit a nitpick that I have. It continues to go through this series, and that's Mike Hosper's continual presentation of putting Reformed theology in a bad light. And again, he does it again in this episode when he talks about Mark Driscoll coming out of the emergent church movement and becoming Reformed. It reads as Mike Hosper conflating Mark Driscoll's meanness with Reformed doctrine while not clarifying that the emergent church movement was an awful movement. And he talks to some of their leaders, Doug Pagitt specifically from the emergent church movement, and presents them as, well, they were the ones that were hurt because Mark kicked them to the curb. He embraced Reformed theology. And so as you listen to it, if you do listen to it and you haven't been mentored in the Bible and you're not familiar with the different movements within evangelicalism, it would sound like Mark did a bad thing by leaving the emergent church and embracing Reformed theology. Therefore, Mark is a mean guy. Therefore, Reformed theology is bad. And so there is this continual kicking of Reformed theology that Mike Hosper does through this series, but it just speaks to what I've said in the previous 2 reviews. Christianity Today is a social justice, woke-leaning organization, and so those are the glasses that they wear, and so they're not going to see Reformed theology in a good light. All right, so that's my nitpick. Now, there are 6 things that I want to talk about in this video review of the series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. The first one is pastoral gifting. And so the point that I want to make here is that pastoral gifting is different from pastor to pastor and from situation to situation. All pastors are not the same. Every pastor has a unique gift mix that fits them for a pastoral context. For example, there are some pastors, or you could think of it like ceilings, for example. Everybody has a ceiling. There are some pastors who can pastor 100 people and do it wonderfully well, but that is their limitation. There are other pastors who have a different kind of gift mix where they can pastor 500 people or 2,500 people or 5,000 people. And so it's important to understand that all pastors are not the same. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to mismatch, meaning putting a pastor in a context where he doesn't have the gift mix in order to pastor in that context. But it's not just the size of the organization of the local church. You can also have a rural pastoral ministry. You can have a urban pastoral ministry, like in Mark's case, he was pastoring in Seattle, Washington. A pastor of 500 folks, again, is not necessarily gifted to plant a church. And so now you have a church planting gift mix that is really for a unique pastor. And then you can have a lead pastor and an associate pastor who have two different gift mixes. One would be the lead guy and the other would be the second guy. In our own ministry, we have a mastermind program where we train Christians to do the work of biblical counseling, which is really just a synonym for discipleship. Every Christian can disciple, but again, there are ceilings. And so it is important for us that we place our students as best as we can subjectively assess them and discern them, but we want to cooperate with God and help them to be placed in the proper context so that they're not in a mismatch to where ultimately they will hurt people. Now, if you just looked at the positive qualities of Mark Driscoll, and you would have to set aside his meanness, his sin habituations, the abuses that he perpetrated on people, if you could just set that aside for a moment, it does look like it wasn't a mismatch, that Mark has the courage, the directiveness, he has the charisma to gather a group of folks and plant a city church. And you hear that coming through with the people who talked about the early years of Mars Hill. Now, that is a positive. I am well aware that there's a lot of negatives that's attached to Mark Driscoll, but again, I just want to set those aside. He could round up the troops, he could take the hill, but if you wanted a pastor to do long-term soul care over a 20-year period, now Mars Hill planted in 1996, they dissolved in 2014. Well, I think one of the reasons that they dissolved is because it became a mismatch. They had a church planting pastor who was now overseeing an organization that they did not anticipate. Now that brings the question to us, are we in the right context? Whether we're pastoring or doing something else, are we the best fit? Or are we a mismatch? Our gift mix would tend to say that we should be in another place. Unfortunately for Mark Driscoll, one of his sin patterns is selfish ambition. And so rather than relinquishing the role that he had at Mars Hill, he stayed in it, and his gifting was not suited for what that church needed on a long-term basis. And so what I want to do and to continue to do is examine my gifting and to talk to others who know me best to see, am I in a best fit? Because one of the worst things you could do is be doing something that you're not gifted for, and if what you're doing is connected to individuals where you could potentially hurt people, like what we talk about in our Mastermind program, then being in a mismatched situation, that's not where you want to be. And so one is the differing pastoral gifting. Number two is this idea of changing vision. There were a lot of folks in this church that they interviewed, and they were there around the 2000 time period, and so the church was like 4 years old. And many of them talked about how they did not expect it to be a mega church, end up being a mega church organization. And I understand that. They expected something else from what they eventually got. Now, perhaps there's just a misunderstanding about progressive development of a vision or an organization. For example, let me use this organization as an illustration. When I started this ministry in 2008, I assumed that I would be counseling until I met Jesus when I was 85 or 95 years old. I never assumed that I would be doing anything like what I do now. In fact, in 2015, I stopped doing biblical counseling as far as one-to-one or doing marriage counseling. You see, I was changing. I mean, the whole idea behind progressive sanctification is that God regenerates us, and then we go into a progressive, sanctifying, incrementally growing process until we do meet Jesus. Peter talked about it as being newborn babes, where the idea we grow from babyhood to womanhood and manhood. Well, also, the Hebrew writer talked about that in Hebrews 5, verses 12, 13, and 14, that we need to mature. We need to not always be drinking milk, but we need to be eating meat. Well, if individuals and a group of them are maturing in the faith, then it will change. I mean, as personal growth happens, we're going to change. I think the converse of that would be troubling to me. A church that never changes, it begs the question about the unique personal development of its leaders. And so the question for you and me is, how are we changing? Are we open to change? I'm not talking about just change for change's sake, but I'm talking about change as an outgrowth of our own walk with God. We want to be changing personally, but that will also affect the relationships and the organizations that we are connected to. And so point number 2 was this idea about a changing vision. It does happen, and I'm saying that honestly it should happen. Then point number 3 is this idea of single-mindedness. One of the things that they talked about, in fact, they shared several stories from people of how exciting this church plant was and how different it was and how compelling it was. Those were common characteristics that came through the enthusiasm of the folks that were there in the beginning. And in the beginning of the church plant, everybody was focused on the newness of the church, or maybe they were thinking about the differences between this plant and whatever their personal experiences was. They had a charismatic, dynamic church planting leader who could channel these energetic folks into a missional force. What they were describing back then was the honeymoon period of the church plant. They were excited about all that God was doing. And then Mike Cosper talked about how this early church enthusiasm made the dysfunction and the ultimate demise all the more painful. And that is true. Whenever we start something, like say your own marriage, you go through a honeymoon period with your marriage, and so you anticipate and you are eager and you are enthusiastic and you're optimistic and you just love what is happening in the marriage. Well, the same thing can happen in a church plant, and it most definitely happened in Mars Hill. But any divorced couple could testify about the pain of where they are now when thinking about the promise of how it all began. And one of the missing things, and maybe it wasn't missing altogether, but one of the missing things in what was going on back then is they really didn't have a sound view, practice of the depravity of humanity. Mark Driscoll is depraved like you and me, meaning that sin is always going to be in the mix. Every married couple needs to understand this. Sin will always be in the mix. Now, I am aware, and Mike Cosper does a good job in talking about the folks who spoke into that, or the folks who tried to speak into the sin patterns and problems of Mark Driscoll. He shares one story in this episode about what may have been an executive assistant, a lady who was an executive assistant to Mark Driscoll, and she tried to speak into that to bring care around Mark, and she ended up being labeled as heretical and getting fired. So I know that people did try to speak into it. But nevertheless, the thing that we want to take away is that we have to have a sin plan. We have to be aware of our depravity and the depravity of those around us, knowing that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to sin, and we want to create an environment of grace to where we can receive the corrective care of others and where we can dispense the corrective care. And so the main focus, while we're enthusiastic about what God is doing in this marriage, we're enthusiastic about what God is doing in this church, we know that the devil is a roaring lion seeking those whom he can devour, crouching at the door. Sin is imminent. And so we want to talk through these things so that when it does happen, inevitably we'll have a plan to work through it. Now, unfortunately, I'm speaking simplistically. The situation at Mars Hill was complicated because of their selfish, ambitious leader that they had. But nevertheless, we want to make sure that we have a sin plan, a way of working through the problems that will inevitably come into any relationship. And so number 4 here is caricature leaders. And that would be speaking to Mark Driscoll specifically. One of the labels that Mike Hosper attached to him, and someone else said this, I believe, in the episode, but Mark Driscoll was a provocateur. And that's why I labeled my 4th point here, caricature leaders. Most pastors are not like this. Most pastors are not. Mark Driscoll is a flash in the pan, celebrity craving individual. He is a caricature of a pastor, but he's really not a pastor. You see, nearly all good pastors are bland. They live in the mundane, and they're just bland, regular people who want to exalt Christ, and they don't want to be on the forefront. They don't want to be a caricature of a pastor like what Mark Driscoll is. They don't want to draw attention to themselves. They want Christ to increase while they decrease. A caricature a caricature provocateur type leader, they are fads. They flame up quickly and they go away just as quickly. They make a lot of noise. They build a following, but they typically do not have longevity. And I trust that you're able to think about your pastor. I trust that your pastor is bland, just a regular guy who loves God, that has a unique gift mix, and he's properly fitted into the context in which he is serving. But he's not this caricature kind of person. If you belong to a church that has someone that maybe is a caricature, provocateur, has some of the qualities, the negative qualities that Mark Driscoll has, and I talked about some of those in the last episode. I trust that God would not only give you the discernment to see into that, but give you the courage to speak into that. And if you do speak into it, and if what happens like what happened to Mark's executive assistant, where he fires her and calls her a heretic, then maybe this would be a situation that you want to consider exiting from. But point number 4, caricature leaders. Number 5, a false conflation. And I talked about this earlier, but I want to come back around to it because this is, in my view, so far, the most troubling aspect about this podcast, and that's CT's disdain for Reformed theology. There is a theme of anti-Reformed theology throughout this series. They talk about the Reformed folks, and here's a quote that somebody used in this episode, little boys with father wounds. And maybe it was Mark Driscoll who said that after he apparently kicked Reformed theology to the curb when he went down to Arizona. But Christianity Today does not explain sound doctrine, but they imply that Reformed teaching is wrong because Mark Driscoll has issues. Conflating a lousy pastor with Reformed theology is careless, and it's an improper agenda in my review, in my view. Mark Driscoll stood for some good things. I mean, he did. He stood for some things that the Bible taught. Masculinity, the husband-wife hierarchy, Reformed theology. Now, he did it in an awful way. He did it in a sinful way. He was mean-spirited in many situations, and those things are well documented. But it is careless and it's lazy to clump everything into the basin and to toss it out with the bathwater. And then finally, point number 6, one-sided stories. Well, maybe I should, here's a question about clumping. When you hear about an individual, I mean, are you able to identify any evidence of grace in that person? When you're having a dust-up, you're having a conflict with your spouse, is your spouse 100% bad? I mean, is there anything that your spouse has done well? From a parenting perspective, when we see all the problems that our children do and all the sin that they commit, Are they doing anything well? I mean, we want to create those contexts where we can identify specific evidences of God's grace in their lives, and we want to encourage them. And that's part of how you create an environment of grace, so that you can come back and communicate the negative thing or the sinful thing in their lives. But if we just clump them all into one thing, and as though everything that they do is bad, then we're going to have a skewed view of what truth is. And unfortunately, I think Christianity today is doing that by clumping everything that Mark Driscoll did. Specifically, I'm talking about masculinity, the husband-wife hierarchy, and also Reformed theology. The Bible teaches those things, even though we, as fallen creatures, can present those things in awful ways. And then number 6 is one-sided stories. Now, I want to be careful as I walk through my last point here. It's essential to know that as you listen to this series, that most of the stories that Christianity today tells, they are from one perspective. I think Mike did say that they've tried to reach out to Mark Driscoll, and he has not responded. But even with that caveat, almost all the stories that they tell are one-sided. Now, I am not saying that their stories are untrue, and so hear me slowly and carefully. I have no reason to doubt any of the stories that are presented, but the discerning listener knows that all accounts have two sides. They just do. I've been doing biblical counseling for a quarter of a century, and I know that when someone presents a case to me, a story to me, I believe them. I listen with charity. I listen with belief, but I do not set aside discernment. There are two things here that we have to hold in balance. It's instructive that Mike continues to interview folks who do not stand for the gospel or do not stand for sound theology. And you want to discern that. I'm not saying that everybody he talks to doesn't have a proper view of the gospel or doesn't have a proper understanding of sound theology, but there are a lot of people that he talks to who have a skewed view of the Bible. I mentioned Christian Dumais in the last episode, who wrote a social justice woke book about white evangelicalism. In a future podcast, he'll be interviewing a person who has walked away from the faith. I'm talking about Josh Harris. In this episode here, he talks to Doug Padgett, who's a part of the ecumenical emergent church movement. And so the people that are talking, that are presenting their case, some of them are sincere Christians who love God and love the Bible, and then many of them, there's this growing cavalcade of folks who do not hold to a sufficiency of Scripture worldview. And so as you listen to these stories, you have to listen with discernment. And so that is an important tension that we have to have in all of our lives. I would not want to hear anyone presenting their case to me and communicate that I don't believe them and I'm not understanding them, I'm not gaining their perspective. I want them to know that, and I work hard at trying to understand, and I do want to believe what they're sharing, but I also cannot kick discernment to the curb. And so this final point here, it's a potentially volatile point. It's a tensious point. But the final point here is one-sided stories. And it's important to understand that. Listen with charity. Listen with discernment. This is my review of episode number 3 of the Christianity Today series, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. If you would like to talk to us, talk to me specifically about these reviews that I'm doing, we have free community forums on our ministry's website. That's where I hang out all day. That's where I dialogue with people. We have so many social media platforms that you could easily fall between the cracks, and I don't want that to happen to you. I want to serve you, but the place where I dialogue is on our ministry website, specifically our forums, and we have free forums for you, and so you're welcome to come, and you can dialogue about this. Maybe you have something else on your mind. If you do, we would love to engage you and perhaps help you if we can with whatever is going on in your life, whatever may be on your mind. Thanks so much for watching.